Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Citizen Voice, the video presentation. It's sponsored by Citizen Sentinel Network and the Lightwing Mission. We also will welcome any additional sponsors, so we're not exclusive. If you are a Citizen Sentinel, we would hope that you could help. But this is the video version of the Citizen Voice, which basically was introduced in our newsletter format. It's now a Tuesday publication. It comes out each week. It's called the Citizen Voice Bulletin. So we are teaching history in these initial programs, and eventually we're going to branch out and hold interviews. The specific focus of the initial programs is dealing with the 1619 project. And if people were paying attention last time, what we were talking about basically was the inception of the 1619 project, which was put together by the New York Times. And the founder, the particular founder of the project, Nicole Hannah Jones. So this particular situation of the 1619 project, we also talked about how it was based off of an understanding of history and how it is taught as a weapon. And this originated from Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn is a professor. Basically, he was a writer, and he had a specific theory about history. And the essence of what he was trying to, I guess there's two main points that he was trying to portray. And the overall point was that history can be used as a weapon, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But the thing that we talked a little bit about last week was that there was a perception that Howard Zinn portrayed that history was only written by the victors, and there then is a victim mentality built into the teaching of history. The idea is that the victims cannot write history because they're victimized or they're oppressed or whatever. And we also talked a little bit about that situation where it's a limited perspective. It's a secular-oriented perspective. Howard Zinn was a socialist, a Marxist, and had that perspective of history. He carried that forward into his own understanding and portrayal of history. His famous book is The People's History of the United States. But if you go back to Marx also failed to incorporate huge swaths of history as he put together his own history. So if we look at Howard Zinn, he influenced a number of individuals. He was a professor at Boston University and other colleges, but ultimately what he did is he portrayed history as this was from the people's perspective who didn't have a chance to write history. In other words, they were the victims, and so they didn't have a chance. So therefore, Howard Zinn took it upon himself and inspired other people to essentially inspire the readers of history that the victims had a voice as well. However, one of the things we pointed out last week is that the victims are not necessarily only voiceless individuals. They have written history. And so the problem comes when you only look at history from a secular perspective. The understanding that people have of history primarily is a secular understanding. However, if you negate the biblical history, then it's only natural that the only history that would be there would be secular history. So what this effort that I am portraying here is an effort to tell true U.S. history, which means that there's a blending of the secular dimension as well as more of a providential perspective coming from how God interacted or intervened in history. So it is a particular way of doing it, and other people may have done it before, but the tendency, if you think about this, the tendency is if somebody who is, say, a Christian writing about the history of the United States from a Christian perspective, many times they will limit or eliminate the understanding that the secularists would bring to that particular history. And then the other side of the other extreme is what I've just explained. When you eliminate a religious perspective in history, then you eliminate a very significant part of history. And these are the people who have witnessed history throughout a good chunk of human history, if you will. The 6,000 years of biblical history is a pretty significant history, and there is a consistency that runs through it. So it should not be ignored. So if you look at Howard Zinn, Howard Zinn had a particular perspective that history could be used as a weapon. And if you look at this slide where this is actually it's taken off of their website. And you can see that, history is a weapon. It's based off of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. I want you to look at this carefully, because this meaning of using history as a weapon, in which many things within our society right now are weaponized. People are using different things that were very substantial foundation stones within the American society as a weapon, or in the way of weaponizing these things. So part of it is, in this respect, attributed to Howard Zinn, who saw that he could use history as a weapon. The real problem is that truth does not matter to secularists when they're writing history. And I'm going to point that out in today's episode. So if you really don't have to worry about truth, which means that there's a more pervasive perspective that you're examining, and also you feel accountable to telling the truth, there's a different way that you put things together in a history book. And if you're looking at the Bible would be a recording. The original foundation there was the scribes, who would actually record the events that were taking place in their time or as they unfolded in the moment. So the scribes were probably the initial historians. And ultimately what we see then, if we look at the Bible, there is a definite timeline. There's a time frame in which certain things happened at different particular times in that unfolding of biblical history. And as we go back into the Bible, you may want to pull that slide up, Spencer, of the Egyptian slavery at the top of that bank of slides. That's essentially what we were talking about last week, is that slavery originated in Africa or in the Middle East at that point in time. One of the points that I made at that point in that presentation was that Joseph, instead of being killed by his brothers in the biblical history, he was imprisoned or put into slavery, sold as a slave, and then he ended up in Egypt. So the slavery that we talk about in Egyptian history, in which the entire population of the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, that is after the slavery that we read about with Joseph. So human slavery existed before the Egyptian slavery of the 400-year or so period of time in which the Hebrew people were enslaved as a people. So slavery has an extensive history. And it's likely that if you started to dig more deeply, you would see that it has a 6,000-year history. So if we're using slavery as a weapon, and this is really what the 1619 Project is about, is using based off of what Zen, the concept that Zen was talking about. This is essentially using a piece of history or a portion of history, which now what they're trying to attempt is a rewriting of American history. So one of the big problems with that is that it doesn't add up mathematically. And it doesn't really matter, because if you're not interested in truth and you're trying to just write a new narrative, then it doesn't matter whether the United States started in 1775 or 1920 or when. The thing is that the history that is going to be written essentially is the history that they want to tell. And I want to basically point out that Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is not a historian, and she didn't claim to be, and she didn't claim that her history of the 1619 Project was a true history. One of the things she said, she says, the fight here, and notice the words fight, which is going back to Howard Zinn, using history as a weapon. She's saying the fight here is about who gets to control the national narrative, and therefore the nation's shared memory of itself. That's a mouthful, but it's also a great deal to chew on. You really need to understand what is going on at this point in time. And, when the Chinese Revolution was over and they started rewriting the history of the Chinese people, many people were shocked in the West that they would, attempt to rewrite history. But I want to make it very clear to you that this is happening right now in America by people like, Howard Zinn has passed away, but like Nicole Hannah-Jones. The 1619 Project and the efforts of this, the New York Times in promoting it is actually expanding across the country. It's being taught in elementary schools, in high schools throughout the United States today. And this is one of the reasons that I feel very strongly involved. Secondly, President Trump initiated a project to combat this effort called the 1776 Project. It was actually based on an idea that Robert Woodson had to combat the 1619 Project of the New York Times. But guess what? One of the first things that the new president has created then is an elimination of the 1776 Project and making the playing field only prime for the people who want to portray history in their way. The controlling of the national narrative and the national shared memory of who we are as people of the United States. So if we look at this carefully, there are some problems with the understanding. If you noticed in this slide of Howard Zinn, this is the beginning of the history book there. Chapter 1 starts with Columbus and what Columbus was doing in the New World. Now, this is called the history of the United States, and most history courses, when they're talking about history of the United States, they start out with Columbus. But Columbus actually never set foot in what is now the continental United States. He actually never entered the territory that we would call continental United States, yet we start talking about Columbus. And there's a reason for that. In reality, they don't talk much about the Vikings. So if you understand that the Vikings were here in the late 1400s, the overall situation is that this occurred many, many years before Columbus, and they actually did set foot in the United States. So why don't we talk about the Vikings? Well, the problem with talking about the Vikings is that the Indians ran them out of this area in North America, in the northern area. Now, were the Vikings, different than the Spaniards who came into the Caribbean? Yes, they were significantly different. But one of the big significant differences is that the Vikings did not have full body armor, and they normally would prefer to fight hand to hand. So the Indians, all they had to do was stand back and shoot arrows at the Vikings and pick them off. And ultimately, the Vikings realized that they could not defend properly against the Indian community in the northern part of North America. The difference is that when Columbus came across the ocean in 1492, a number of years before Columbus sailed, they invented full body armor in Europe. So there was a technological invention that actually empowered the Spaniards not only to win the war against the Moors or against the Muslims in Spain, but also to come across the Atlantic Ocean and bully their way into the lives of these people that we would call the indigenous population. So history can be used as a weapon based upon how you view it. If you ignore what happened with the Vikings, which doesn't fit into the narrative of Columbus, and we'll get into that Columbus narrative in a bit, but it doesn't fit. So when we're looking at only one thing, and that one thing is actually limited, then we commit, as historians, we would commit the sin of omission. And that's a big problem, because you leave things out of the picture. And leaving the narrative of the Vikings out of the picture of the North American history, or the history of America, U.S. history, is a significant reality. It doesn't fit into the narrative. Why? Because the narrative is victim mentality, if you remember. It's portraying the situation of the individuals who were the conquerors, because they're the only ones who write about history. Well, one of the problems with that is that the American Indians many of them didn't have a written language. And then those that did, they didn't necessarily want to share any of their stories with the dominant white race that was coming across the ocean. They just chose not to share, because they didn't really feel that they had much value in sharing things. And it goes back to, what Jesus said to his own disciples. He said, if people aren't listening to you, then why cast your pearls before swine? Now, the concept is similar, but the thing is that when you have a particular perspective and you pursue it to the point of using it as a weapon, when it's not true, then truth doesn't matter. This is what I'm basically saying. But truth does matter to people like me, or people who are religious individuals, or people who are struggling for truth, trying to find it, even if they're not religious. So let's go back to Columbus. Howard Zinn doesn't talk about the concept of what actually happened honestly in his book, The People's History of the United States. And so it's an intellectual dishonesty that I would challenge. And, I'm not a professor of history, so please don't put me on that level. What I am is a journalist, and I do a lot of research. And if I could do this research, I would believe that honest individuals who call themselves intellectuals or professors of history, they should have been able to find this information as well. So when we look at the situation of Columbus, many people don't know about a community that was called La Navidad. And the La Navidad was, according to Howard Zinn, it was a fort that Columbus made as he created the situation for the Spanish crown in the New World. But that's far from the truth. Yet, it's accepted in the book. Now, let's take a look at what the truth is. Just before Christmas, the Columbus expedition, which was only 3 ships, and many of you will probably remember from your early history, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria was the largest ship. It was a flagship, and the other ships were 2 smaller ships that were faster, and they carried less crew. The larger ship was Columbus's ship that he sailed on, And just before Christmas, the situation of that ship ran aground. Somebody allowed a cabin boy to be the guy who was stealing the ship or steering the ship. I guess you could say he was stealing it too, because he had complete control of where the ship went, but he drove it right into the ground. La Hispaniola was the place where they ended up. Now, they had already explored the islands in a number of different places, but the situation of La Navidad, it's named after Christmas. Navidad is Christmas in Spanish. Why did they build this? Because they couldn't get the ship off the island. Even they invited the Indians who they had made friends with to push the ship off the island and all the crew. Now, one of the problems was that one of the ships was tied to the Santa Maria. The other ship had gone off in search of gold. They could not push that ship, or they could not pull that ship, no matter how hard they tried, off the sandbar or off the land. So what did they do? Columbus had to make a decision. There were approximately 30 sailors on each of those ships that they had there. And then on the larger Santa Maria, which was the largest ship, they had probably 50 to 60 crew members, not necessarily exact numbers, but you get the picture that there were quite a few people that were on that ship. Now, each of the smaller ships had their own crews. So when Columbus tried to get crew for the Santa Maria, he ran into a problem. He couldn't find anybody that wanted to go across the ocean because there was a great deal of fear in the people's minds. Many sailors even did not want to go straight across the ocean because that's not the way sailing was done in those days. Most sailing ships sailed close to the shore. They sailed close to the shore primarily for landmarks so that they could get back home, and also if they needed to get fresh water or food, they sailed close to the shore. What Columbus was, what he was trying to do, what he was promoting, was to go across this huge body of water. So he didn't find many takers in terms of, what he was asking to have happen. So the treasury of the king of Spain at that time, King Ferdinand, suggested that all King Ferdinand had to do would be open up the prisons and give people an opportunity to sail with Columbus. So guess who the majority of the crew members were on the Santa Maria? Prisoners who were released from prison, and then some of Columbus's own relatives. Now, when Columbus found that he had to leave this ship, he decided to take it apart and create a village. The village became known as La Navidad. They created the village right next to where the Indian village was. The actual reality was it was not a fort. It was a place where people could stay until Columbus came back the next year. And when he did come back, every one of those sailors had been massacred by the Indians. Now, why is this important? Well, this is essentially elimination of a period of history that's not taught. Let me ask you a question. If we didn't talk about December 7th, 1941 in history, would that make any difference? If we erase that one day, just that day when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, would it make a difference? Well, you bet. It would make a difference. Many people studying history would want to know why the United States was attacking Japan, why they were giving Japan such a hard time, why we were fighting and creating an aggressive effort against the Japanese imperial military. So when Columbus did come back, he found that all of those sailors, including his brother-in-law, had been murdered. They were killed. If we think about this, that's a pretty significant event in history that's not been told. Howard Zinn puts one sentence about La Navidad in his book. Now, if you were, and actually there were 17 ships that returned with Columbus, back to the islands where he had discovered them. 17 ships. Now, those ships contained a lot of conquistadors because the King of Spain suddenly became interested. And if you were a conquistador who had just been through the wars with the Moors and you felt pretty macho, and you saw that your compatriots, who were not compatriots of Columbus because Columbus was Italian, these were Spaniards who were coming back with Columbus. Do you think it would have made a difference to the Spaniards who saw their friends, their relatives, or people that they knew murdered? Many of them were piled in front of the village of La Navidad. They were still there. So that massacre is ignored. It's not talked about in human history. So this is one of the things that I'm talking about. If we're going to talk about Columbus, then we need to talk about La Navidad. We need to talk about the realities of what happened when Columbus went there. I'm going to introduce another point. The progressive revisionist historians who talk about Columbus, they basically deal with a person by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. And de las Casas is quoted as the guy who was talking about all the atrocities that Columbus committed in that point in time. However, the real problem is they do not talk about Father Panay. Father Panay was a young Catholic friar who was asked by Columbus to study the Indian people, to study the Taino, to study the Arawakan on that second voyage. And after seeing the atrocities, Columbus still asked for a person to go and study the Indian people. I imagine Father Panay must have felt freaked out of his mind because he saw the dead bodies in front of him. And in reality, he still went. He spent 4 years with the Taino. Is that taught in American history class? No, it's not taught. Why is that important? Because actually it's the first history of the indigenous people. And we're talking about the history of the United States. Howard Zinn doesn't talk about Father Panay. So when we talk about they don't care about truth, it's true. There is no sense of whether truth matters or not. And if truth doesn't matter to the secularist historians, then you're going to get pieces of it. One of the concepts that I talked about last time was looking through the lenses of the history that we have experienced since the time that we are examining or we're looking at. So if we look at things in the 20th century or the 19th century, the 18th century, many things happened over that span of history that changed our perspective of reality. And if we're looking through 21st century lenses back at history that happened in the 1500s, and we're expecting people to have the same kind of morality that we have today, that's intellectually dishonest as well. So if we're looking at history from the standpoint of what kind of handle we can get and what kind of angle we can present to make it look the worst that it can, it also is understanding history from that perspective, because we're using our 21st century values and imposing them on people from another time. Totally. It makes about as much sense as saying, George Washington didn't drive a Chevrolet. He drove a Ford. Can you imagine? Doesn't even make any sense. It has no relevance. Yet these people who are educated people will try to purvey history or portray history in such a way that they are not offering truth, complete truth. So we're going to talk about Columbus next time because they decide to talk about Columbus in the teaching of the people's history of the United States. We're going to look at the situation of the Columbus experiment or the Columbus effort from one perspective, and that perspective is from Columbus's eyes and from the eyes of those people around him at that point in time, not from our 21st century eyeglasses. So if you join me next week, you'll be able to get a little bit better perspective on Christopher Columbus at this point. Hopefully you can join us next week. We want to thank you so much for viewing today, and I'm hoping that you were able to get a little bit more clear about history in world history at this point, but how it actually impacted North America. Thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you again next week.